So in this video, we're going to discuss the book of Nehemiah. So before we jump into Nehemiah, I want to clear something up that I mentioned in the last video, the little world history lesson. So remember that the 10 northern tribes went into Assyrian captivity, and then Babylon overthrew Assyria, and then Babylon came and took the 2 southern tribes captive. So basically at that point, all 12 tribes are kind of underneath the umbrella of Babylon. Well, during those 70 years before the remnant returns to Jerusalem, Persia overtook Babylon. So that's how we get the Persian kings that we mentioned last week. I failed to mention that. So let's think about the book of Nehemiah. So we mentioned last week that Nehemiah and Ezra were originally one book, but just for the sake of how they're laid out in our English Bible, we're going to treat Nehemiah as one book. When we think about who wrote the book of Nehemiah, most people think it was Nehemiah himself. When we think about who it was written to those remnant that returned to Judah and Jerusalem. When we think about how much time is covered, it was approximately 12 years. So the main idea of the book is Nehemiah was sent out to the city of Jerusalem to oversee the building of the city walls. And he faces trouble both internally and externally as he sets out to rebuild the walls. And it's really interesting to note that last week when we talked about Ezra, it was the rebuilding of the temple and their worship and rebuilding the people spiritually as Ezra taught them the law. And in this book, it's the rebuilding of the walls, which is physical protection. But it really just goes to show you that they considered the spiritual protection more important than the physical protection. There's just a few notable characters in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah himself, and then we see Ezra again, and then the 2 enemies, Sanballat and Tobiah. When we think about notable events, Ezra returns to Judah to find the city walls in shambles, and he does a survey at night to go and kind of check everything out. He begins to rebuild the walls, but then Sanballat hears of the rebuilding, and he begins to be angry with him and to jeer him and kind of make fun of him. So the work is stopped, and then it resumes again, and then you have some conspiracies within against Nehemiah, but then they get to work and they finish the wall in only 52 days, which is pretty amazing. And then Ezra reads the law to the people, and the Feast of Booths is celebrated. When we think about where on the timeline, again, it falls under that section of return to Jerusalem. And also, Nehemiah is the last book of the Old Testament when we look at it chronologically, because we only have one more book of history to go, and that's Esther. But Esther takes place during this time. So when Nehemiah ends, that is the end of the Old Testament history, the end of the history of the Jewish nation as we have it recorded in our New Testament. When we think about Jesus, there's really no direct prophecy or direct new seed line. There's some things out there that people say about all the gates that are described in the walls, and that prefigures Jesus being the true gate and some things like that. But I don't really want to go there because I don't want to stretch and try to make something when there's really not anything. So just let you read the book and you decide if you see any direct mentions of Jesus. So we're going to end by thinking about why we should read the book of Nehemiah, and why we should study it. And just like the book of Ezra, he encounters trouble when he sets out to do the work. He has people from the outside making fun of him and being angry with him. He has troubles from within, but he doesn't let any of that stop him, and he comes up with a plan, and he works hard, and he accomplishes the task that is set before him. So I think we can learn a lot about that to apply to our own lives. But the last thing I'm going to submit to you is just the priority and the emphasis that is placed on physical protection. So the walls would have only been for physical protection against enemies, but that was kind of put on the back burner because we saw from Ezra that the temple and restoring worship was top priority, and teaching people the law, that was top priority. And then once that was kind of in place, then it's time to rebuild the walls. So for our lives, we need to think, are we looking to make things comfortable for us in a physical sense, and kind of putting spiritual things on the back burner? So that's just something to think about. in your own life. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope it has inspired you to tackle the book of Nehemiah. It's a fairly short read. There's not many chapters. You could do it in one sitting. And so we'll finish up next week when we look at the book of Esther, and that will finish the section of scripture known as history.